you are ready, Rachel.
Sure.
Rachel,
Well,
tell us a little bit about yourself and the background behind your work.
absolutely. Thanks for having me. This is my first time being a part of a virtual artist reception, and so it's a new experience for me, and I'm grateful that there are people here to listen to us.
It's just like throwing a regular party. Are people going to come?
Yes. So thank you for being here. My name's Rachel Deutmeyer, and I grew up in Eastern Iowa, and that has a lot to do with the images that you'll see for my project. Didn't grow up on a farm, but was in a fairly rural area, as is a lot of small town Midwest. And so saw a lot of farms, had a lot of friends growing up that lived on farms. And so that's been really informative to sort of the development of my work. I got my graduate degree also from Iowa State University, and my thesis project was focused on a family farm that had, the farmers had retired, and with them, the land retired. And so that gave me a different perspective of the relationship between people and place, and a farm as a place. And I really started to see what a deep emotional connection they had to their farm, and all of the, like many of us, all the stories that come out of just the experiences that we have at a place. And so that then led me to, I guess, become not a hobby farmer quite yet, as much as I hope to be someday, but a farming enthusiast in my practice, and considering the different ways that we approach land, and looking at the broad range of agricultural practices now, from a lot of monoculture agricultural situations in the Midwest to everything from that to urban gardens and smaller scale farms. And so this project is sort of rooted in this exploration of different types of place. I think they're all from Iowa, actually, where I'm looking at a farm that I volunteered at, a small scale farm, and then comparing that to some other instances of the land and places that I experienced around that. Some of these images will note that they're from Mustard Seed Farm, which is a small farm near Ames, like this one, for example. They have a CSA program, and I was able to volunteer there, and in exchange for my help with their harvest, I got to take a huge box of agriculture of produce home with me. And so that was well worth my time, but that's a tangent. But what I really learned from that place was just that it doesn't have to be one practice or another. And there's a lot of contemporary and intellectual debate that goes far beyond me between this practice of monoculture being, the most financially viable and the most productive, but also maybe not the most sustainable practice. And then you have other approaches with permaculture and with smaller scale family farms. And so all these images are taking scenes from different farms or land maps, and combining them in new ways of exploration, of thinking about how do these things relate to one another? How does a field of one crop relate to a smaller neighboring farm of a much different scale? And so they also, then the other piece of this is that partially maybe just based on the winter weather, partially maybe based on aspects of quarantine, I started getting back into a practice of digital collage. And so most of these works are the combinations of multiple photographs and prints and some drawings layered in there. And I like thinking about quilts and how they relate to land, especially farms and aerial views of land. And so we see some really geometric things, squares and diamonds, but then the images within that are of much more organic nature. And so the edges don't always line up. I like that quilting in some ways, I think, relates to these ideas of subdividing land or cultivating land or making changes and then reconstructing things and putting them back together, and they become somehow different and new. And But I'm just all over the place. Those are some of the thoughts and things that I consider as I approach my work. And
No, that's wonderful.
yeah, really this process of digital collage is very new to me too. And so I feel in some ways I'm still sort of reflecting on, you know, how the relationships of combined images are very different than creating just a straight photograph and letting that exist on its own.
So a lot of these are in Iowa, and now you're living in Missouri. Do you see some crossover with farming between the two areas?
Yeah, as much as I've noticed some qualities of Missouri that are very different than Iowa, there are also a lot of similarities in that it's still in our area. I teach at William Woods University in the art department, and we're in Fulton, Missouri, which is near Columbia, so generally central Missouri. It's still primarily an agricultural region, but one of the things that relates to this project that I have become really fond of is some of the prevalence of prairie near us. There are multiple nature preserves where either individuals or the government, depending on the property, are wanting to restore natural Missouri prairie. And it's just such an interesting experience in that I feel like there are a lot of similarities between prairie as a place and some farms as a place, with all these individual pieces of, you know, of just the complex ecology of the place. And so it's been interesting. It still feels very much like home, and I see a lot of connections between, but we live a lot closer to some natural prairie, which has been interesting to explore too. And one of these, this one actually, was taken in Ames, in town of an urban prairie area. And I just really admire these initiatives to reinstate natural places and preserve nature, even in urban settings. And so again, I'm just interested in the relationships between these pieces and how they become a more complex whole, really.
Did you mention that you one day want to have your own farm?
Yes, yeah. Certainly at the hobby farm scale. Yeah.
What would be the number one thing you would want on your farm?
Oh, what a question. Flowers.
There you go.
Prairie flowers. And that's one thing that I noticed at Mustard Seed as a property, is that they have all these borders of, it's so different than the experience of just one crop in one place. You know, they use prairie as a border to their crops to add pollinators to those crops. And so it just, the more I've learned, the more complex these things seem to be. And in a lot of ways, that's why I feel it starts to become necessary to combine different images. And I think of a project by Terry Evans, who's a photographer. She has a project called Ancient Prairie, where she's combining multiple images, more so linearly, and these photographs kind of stacked of the same place, but taken over different periods of time. And similarly with what I'm doing with the quilt, I feel like it just adds a different level of engagement when you see the photograph sort of dissected into different pieces and then reconstructed again. And really relates to some of the agricultural practices too.
We've had guests in the gallery wonder if the quilt inspiration came from barn quilts that are on the side of barns.
Yeah, you know, it didn't, but I've thought of that, especially with the one you have up now. And I think that too connects to ideas of heritage and of pride in place, and of the significance of, you know, families that have lived at the same properties or farmed the same land. And it really is sort of a Midwest icon in some ways when you travel and see barn quilts.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I should, and a good maybe source of inspiration for me too.
Awesome.
Do you have any current or upcoming works that you're working on that you'd like to talk about?
You know, one thing that sort of leading or coming out of this project is that I've started to make lumen prints and cyanotypes, both of which are camera-less processes of making images, where you can place something like a leaf on a piece of light-sensitive paper and it will leave an imprint. And so I've started to work with more of those, and instead of digital collage, have started to cut those apart and reconstruct them. And there's something really interesting about, oh, I see Lauren's comment. Thank you. There's something really interesting about the actual pieces of nature leaving their marks on the paper as well. And so that's all quite new. So we'll see where it goes.
Nice. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Seho,
Yes.